Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's talk is entitled Practice-Oriented Pragmatic Trials Can Integrate Innovations More Rapidly in Evidence-Based Medicine. My name is Kelsey Brown, and I am the Medical Writing Manager at Transperfect Life Sciences in London, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. Today's event will run for approximately 60 minutes, and that includes time for questions and answers towards the end with our speakers. So we'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. This session is designed to be interactive, so it works best when you're involved. Feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker by using the questions chat box, which is located in your control panel, and we'll get to your questions during the Q&A session at the end. If you need any help at any time, any assistance, you can reach out to me by sending me a message using your control panel as well. And at this time, you're in listen-only mode. And you can just take note here, the session will be recorded and it'll maybe be made available to you on the IDDI website in about 24 hours after the webinar is complete. So you can always go back and watch at a later time. This event is proudly hosted by the International Drug Development Institute, IDDI. IDDI is an expert center in biostatistical and integrated e-clinical services for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in several disease areas, including oncology and ophthalmology. IDDI optimizes the clinical development of drugs, biologics, and devices thanks to proven statistical expertise and operational excellence. Founded in 1991, IDDI is headquartered near Brussels in Belgium with a U.S. Center of Operations in Raleigh, North Carolina. So today's speaker will be introduced by Everardo Saad. I'll let you go ahead and introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. We are continuing our series of topics with invited speakers, focusing mostly around randomized trials. And so our speakers come from all over the world. Last time our speaker came from very far away from Australia. And today our speaker comes from the same country where IDDI has its headquarters, namely Belgium. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Holstart. Frank is currently a senior researcher at the KCE, or the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center. Frank is a physician, and he has previously worked in drug development. He had passage through several pharmaceutical and medical device companies, and eventually he got involved in health technology assessment and has joined KCE in 2004. He is now, as I said, a senior researcher there, and he is mainly involved in health technology assessments and also in KCE designed trials, which is a program of publicly funded practice-oriented trials, as he'll tell us. So his I don't have the title of his talk right in front of me, but Frank is going to tell us about practice-oriented trials and how that can expedite drug development. Frank, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Everardo. Thank you for having me, and I will talk about the more pragmatic practice-oriented trials from a healthcare payer perspective, and I'll give you the example of the KCE trials program. So my talk will consist of 3 parts. First, I will introduce health technology assessment and the healthcare payer perspective, the evidence gaps observed, and also some health economic aspects. Then I will talk about publicly funded practice-oriented trials and the start of the KCE trials program, to come to the pragmatic trials continuum and its possible role also in the pre-market phase. So the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center was started in 2004. So it's a public institute with researchers in medicine, economics, statistics, and all the studies that are conducted are made public on the website. And that concerns practice guidelines, health services research, and important for this talk, health technology assessment. And in that context, in 2016, a program of publicly funded clinical trials was started named KCE Trials, and that fits with the health technology assessment stratum. Important to know is that we produce in the reports policy recommendations, but no decisions are made. The KCE board, in fact, consists of the different stakeholders in the Belgian healthcare landscape, including industry, but also the different federal agencies, as well as the clinicians, the nurses, and so forth. Health Technology Assessment Institutes and health technology assessment still today is a member state competence in Europe. And you see here that in the 90s, there were health technology assessment bodies that were specialized in non-drug assessments and other agencies in pharmaceutical assessments. And now we see more and more broad health technology assessment bodies such as KCE and dealing with different types of interventions. The bodies in Europe try to work together, and that is named UNETA collaboration, but also in this field some evolutions are appearing. So health technology assessment is very different from the perspective of a technical innovator. And technical innovator will try to find new pathways, technical breakthroughs, whereas on the other side of the spectrum, the health technology assessment will deal with patient benefit in the routine practice. So that is a big difference, and clinical development tries to overcome and this gap, and what we call here this evidence gap. An important evolution has been that not only regulators provide scientific advice before pharmaceutical companies start the confirmatory trials, the phase 3, but also health technology assessment bodies in an early dialogue or parallel scientific advice together with regulators provide such advice. And that is important because the perspective of the two are different. And so typically confirmatory trials focus on internal validity, safety, and efficacy, whereas health technology assessment will look also to external validity, comparative effectiveness, added therapeutic benefit, and cost effectiveness, as well as budget impact. And the alignment of regulators and HTA bodies is not perfect, as illustrated here. A comparative analysis of the regulatory HTA parallel scientific advices given, and you see some disagreements between regulators and HTA bodies when it comes to advice on the comparator to be used in the phase 3, on the endpoints, on the study population, for example. And that is true not only for pharmaceuticals, but also for medical devices. There, the situation is even more complex because in Europe, we have a system where medical devices enter the market quite rapidly, quite early, based on a CE mark and based on device performance. And for innovative high-risk medical devices in the US under a PMA, demonstration of effectiveness is needed using mainly a randomized trial. And so this early introduction in Europe creates some tension between, well, on one hand, the regulatory system allowing such early introduction, and then the healthcare payers. They require some proof of effectiveness, preferably based on randomized data, and often one has to wait for the randomized trial demanded by the FDA. Back to pharmaceuticals. When, for example, here for severe asthma, multiple drugs came to the market to treat severe asthma, at that time they had not been compared one to the other. So for the clinician and for the optimal use in clinical practice, there is crucial information missing still. Which drug is best for each unique patient? There are no head-to-head comparisons. Are there biomarkers that can predict the therapeutic response? So real-life effectiveness and safety in specific populations. And how long do we need to treat? So many questions clinicians have when such drugs come to the market, and clinicians still have questions on how to use them. Can this be remedied? Can this be helped? The same is true for immunotherapies in oncology. For example, there you see these immunotherapies now in most tumor types. In many tumor types, the response is rather low. And so there is a need for better biomarkers to predict the response. On the other hand, also, what is the optimal duration of immunotherapy? A question still out there. And as these molecules are quite expensive and they are used in many different tumor types, there is an important budget impact. So indeed, the cost, the cancer drug cost, but also other pharmaceuticals, has increased over the last decades, and this on the y-axis is actually a log scale showing the monthly cost of treatment in US dollars. And so this increase in drug costs has also led to an evaluation of benefits and costs, and benefits are actually measured in either life years gained or quality adjusted life years gained, as you can see on this graph. And it's actually using the new health technology. You see on the y-axis the quality of life. So you can maintain a high quality of life for a longer period compared versus the standard of care. And so the difference between the two curves is then the overall qualities gained. Why is this important? And here you see on this graph on the y-axis, the difference, in fact, in costs between two interventions. And on the x-axis, the increase in effectiveness, often measured in QALYs. And most innovations, in fact, they are introduced in the first quadrant. And so they are more effective, but they are also more costly. And so the ratio between the incremental cost over incremental effect typically is then assessed. This is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And in the UK, for example, if that ICER is above £30,000 per QALY, then the likelihood of reimbursement is rather low. Now, how is this ICER determined? How is it estimated? In fact, it is about the future, and the clinical trial data are often not very long-term, so there is a model needed. But of course, it's better to model based on data and essentially comparative data versus the standard of care, and to avoid as much as possible the assumptions in such a model. Here is the example of targeted therapy in oncology with the different study designs based on biomarkers. And so on the one hand, the full-fledged design with the biomarker stratified randomized trial, where also biomarker negatives are randomized between the experimental drug and the control. Versus on the right side, the phase 2 single-arm trial where only biomarker positives are exposed to the experimental drug without a control. And what we often now see is that some drugs enter the market just based on such a phase 2 single-arm study. And of course, then it becomes very difficult to have comparative data and assess the benefit for healthcare payers. Now, for targeted therapies, another element not to be forgotten is the quality of the biomarker, especially, and here is the example given of Herceptin in early breast cancer, but on the other hand also Xalkori, crizotinib in non-small cell lung cancer, where the prevalence of the biomarker is only 4%. And then, of course, the specificity of the test for the target population becomes crucial, and you need a very specific test to detect those patients who can benefit from the intervention. Now, randomization or real-world evidence, real-world data. What do healthcare payers think about this? On the other hand, healthcare payers, they aim to maximize health within the available budget. And when drugs come to the market, comparative trials are often missing comparisons with the standard of care, the usual care. Practice-oriented or pragmatic trials recruit a broad patient population, reflect the routine care, and are quite informative to healthcare decision makers. An example here, actually an anecdote on the importance of randomization, is the case of renal denervation. Actually, a collaboration between European countries led to a draft HTA report that landed on my desk, where the conclusion was that it appears to decrease the blood pressure, whereas the effect of other systems are uncertain. So in general, it was a rather positive report. And actually, given the situation that at that time already this intervention was reimbursed in 13 countries in Europe, often regardless of the type of device. And actually the same day, a press release came out on the randomized trial that was being conducted to enter the market in the US, where no efficacy could be demonstrated and all trials were put on hold. So that illustrates that observational real-world data are important, but are not sufficient in most cases. Now, how to fill this evidence gap that we described? One option would be to align the evidentiary requirements of regulators and payers. For example, where possible, to conduct in the pre-market phase at least one randomized trial versus standard of care with patient-relevant outcomes, and that would be in line with the Helsinki Declaration and would allow the evaluation of the added therapeutic value. Another option is to perform the missing comparative trial in the post-market phase, but at that stage, industry support is unlikely, so there is a need then for the public to fund, so publicly funded trials. There's a role for the healthcare payers. But Importantly, also in this context, is that running a clinical trial, this is not done in a minute, so this takes time. So essential time is lost actually for patients. In 2015, KCE produced a report on publicly funded practice-oriented clinical trials, and one of the conclusions was that in addition to patient benefit, such publicly funded trials can provide a positive return on the investment for the government, for the healthcare payers. And this is illustrated here. At that time, a number of programs or studies could be analyzed. What was the investment with public means and what was the return? And was this a positive return? And from NIH, and there is a case study, the Women's Health Initiative, there is the neurological program at NIH returning so 45 times the investment. Of course, the remark, and this is assuming $40,000 US per quality gained. Sorry. In the Netherlands, the evaluation of the Zon and Wei program, in fact, looked at net savings only and could demonstrate that every euro invested returned like 3 euros in savings for the healthcare payer system. And here are the references of these calculations. So these practice-oriented non-commercial clinical trials, the funding then needs to come from the public, the healthcare departments, or from universities or charities. The aim is to optimize the clinical practice, often comparative effectiveness. And the interventions are broad, so it's not only pharmaceuticals, but it's also surgery, lifestyle interventions, psychotherapy, or screening, for example. And of course, the trials need to be international if appropriate. Often these trials are lower risk compared with clinical trials for development or translational research. So this led to the KC Trials program that started in 2016 and was set up, in fact, in collaboration with the NIHR in the UK and Zon en Wei in the Netherlands. So 2 existing programs looking for efficiency gains in the healthcare system. So the focus is on pragmatic practice-oriented trials, mainly comparative effectiveness, but also repurposing of old drugs is funded. The topics can be commissioned or can come from investigators. Patients are involved right from the start, from the study design onwards. And then in the selection, also policymakers are involved to select the right research questions, in addition to a broad panel of clinicians. Clinical trial units are important to make sure that the trial is conducted according to the standard rules. KCE in this whole setup is the funder of the program. And so the non-commercial sponsor is often a university hospital, or another hospital. And there is a strict data sharing policy such that the healthcare decision makers can and institutes can use the data for decision making. So this is the scope, as mentioned. So the primary aim of these trials is non-commercial. We look to possibilities of cost effectiveness interventions, cost saving options, and off-label use is accepted. And it's a broad range of interventions that can be funded, and multi-center trials, and also abroad if needed. So for repurposing, this is off-patent drugs with a high value for money proposition. And of course, the evidence needs to be sufficient to justify the start of a large multicenter confirmatory trial. What do we mean with pragmatic practice-oriented trials? So we look for endpoints that have to do with quality of life or survival. So these are the two main endpoints for health technology assessment bodies. As you've seen, the quality adjusted life years gained depend on utilities, and these can be derived using a generic questionnaire, for example, the EQ5D. And of course, in addition, disease-specific questionnaires can also be used and have a value. So in contrast with the typical placebo-controlled efficacy trial, the comparator in comparative effectiveness trial is an active comparator, often the usual care, and the study population is the broad patient population, in contrast to development trials that have a narrow study population with many exclusion criteria often in the protocols. Now, for such publicly funded trials, there were three criteria that can be called key success factors. One topic is the selection, which is important. Do your homework, the professional conduct of the trial, and then not only the publication of the results is important, but also the implementation in clinical practice and the consequences, for example, on the reimbursement system. And in order to achieve this, and this is what we have implemented for the KCE trials program, is to have panels for the selection, a trials board to look at the scientific rigor of the proposals, to have clinical trial units in place in the large hospitals to help the investigators with the conduct of such trials. And then finally, when it comes to implementation, to make sure that also our KCE board is involved in the implementation. And in addition, we have started some risk reduction efforts to select the high quality trials to deliver in time and within budget. So the selection process is in multiple review cycles where each time investigators are kind of helped to improve the protocol and reviewed by statisticians also to make sure that there are no flaws in the protocol on that aspect. The payment and the costing of the trial is activity-based, and this has actually been published. So I think this is also an important item, so to make sure that the right amount is paid for a clinical trial. It is not inexpensive, and we will come back to that, running clinical trials, as you all know. Then feasibility, and that's where it often goes wrong with academic clinical trials. So there we do have a feasibility check, and not only by the sponsor, but also the KCE as funder collaborates with the CRO to have a check of the feasibility at the different study sites. And actually the sponsor receives an advance payment to make sure that this is done. And once the study is started, the microscopic monitoring of the progress is important. And here we have a tool that named EDGE that shows the recruitment, and it's updated every week, in fact, at each site. And this is in a very transparent way, so all the stakeholders can follow the progress of where the public money goes, in fact. So now we reach the pragmatic trials, and so this can be contrasted with explanatory trials where causal research hypothesis is tested, and where pragmatic trials help more to choose between care options. There is another definition where pragmatic trials is measuring effectiveness versus explanatory trials generally measuring efficacy under ideal conditions, and effectiveness is in the routine clinical practice. Here are some examples of publications on pragmatic trials, and I would like to focus the attention on the 6S trial, which created indeed some change in practice with the crystalloid solutions in patients with severe sepsis. But of course, there is many other pragmatic trials that have were practice changing, in fact. Here we see on the left side some characteristics of a pragmatic trial. So as mentioned, patients that are representative of the routine practice. So not so many exclusion criteria in the protocols. Interventions slotted into the usual care, so few extra visits, in fact. Flexibility in delivery and adherence, so also there to try to reflect how it happens in routine care. Also the follow-up visits reflecting usual care and also the assessments. And then the primary outcome needs, of course, to be patient relevant. And surrogates are not used if possible. And in fact, this pragmatic trials versus explanatory trial is more a continuum rather than a 1-0 choice. It is more of an attitude towards trial design, but it should definitely not be considered as a synonymous to easy to conduct or sloppy. And there is a way to assess how pragmatic your trial is using this PRECI2 indicator. And this is a summary where you can indicate for each of the variables to which degree the pragmatic aspect is present or not in your trial. There is also a consort statement on the reporting now of pragmatic trials. So in addition to the standard consort statement. And some aspects on pragmatic trials on site selection. For example, we try to include not only high volume sites, but also typical sites that see patients in the routine care setting. They are often smaller sites and often lack the infrastructure and the experience to participate in clinical trial, but they have the more representative patients. So there, of course, the feasibility and the training is key before such sites can participate in the clinical trial. And so they need some support, financial support, and so the initiation and the training is important there. So the representative patients reflecting the routine target group. So often in strict randomized trials, only 15% of the total patient population is eligible for the trial. And so for example, registry-based randomized trials, there often 70% of all the patients with the disease can participate. So that's more relevant also for healthcare payers, for example, and also for clinicians. So in terms of inclusion-exclusion criteria, investigators should avoid to copy-paste from past registration trials. And electronic data collection can help, of course. Here we reimburse, of course, patients for the transport costs as appropriate. And then the outcomes, they include the effects of co-medication, non-adherence, placebo effects. We try to avoid to keep patients in the trial, of course, to avoid missing data. And the outcome assessment, if it is blinded, if it is not placebo-controlled trial, then this is, of course, preferred, and as well as objective outcomes. For superiority trials, the intention to treat principle, of course, and then for non-inferiority designs, the per protocol analysis is standard, but of course there we need to be very careful that the study is conducted in a high quality way. For the primary endpoint, the choice should be what is the endpoint that will make you use or implement or reimburse the intervention. So what is the outcome that is most influential for the clinical decision? It should have, the follow-up should be long enough, and that's often not the case in registration trials. So that is a difference. And yeah, surrogate endpoints are to be avoided if possible. So it should be patient-relevant endpoints rather than endpoints that are accepted by the regulators. An important evolution for outcomes is the trend towards core outcome sets. In order to have a consistent measurement of relevant outcomes in clinical trials, they are developed with different stakeholders and published. And the purpose, of course, is to enable comparison of study results and meta-analysis. And this initiative, for example, here, the COMET initiative, and they have on their website for different diseases, the relevant endpoints grouped. And so we advise investigators to consult this website when they apply for funding. Further on outcomes, the patient-reported outcomes are important, and patients in general are involved right from the beginning. The outcome in general should be easy and clinically relevant for the interpretation. And then an important remark is that more and more we should move towards routinely collected data, electronic health records, existing registries. And a very nice example is the recovery trial in the context of COVID-19, where essentially the data collection was limited to a single page, and all other variables were obtained using data linkage with existing data sets, some 4 data sets that existed already for the routine care. So this way one can run, and this is illustrated here. This was a very nice presentation on large sample trials, including this recovery trial presented at the International Clinical Trials Day recently. Another example of an efficient trial design is the registry-based randomized trial. The advantage, and this was actually Jonas Aldgren from Uppsala presenting at the KCE Trial Symposium in 2017. The advantage of registry-based randomized trial is that here 70% of the patients in the registry actually participated to this randomized trial. what he also told is that, what Jonas also told is that clinicians, when seeing the patients back, were actually not aware anymore that the patient was in the clinical trial, because they did the routine care interventions as usual. And the big advantage is for the clinical trial that recruitment can go very fast. And so it's a representative patient population, because the majority of the patients are in the trial. And of course, when you have a high quality registry, that's a condition, but then you can run such a randomized trial for a relatively low cost compared with the traditional approach. And actually, the two trials were published in the New England Journal of Medicine concerning STEMI patients and thrombectomy. So very similar designs and patient populations, and the cost and was lower, and the recruitment period was actually faster for the registry-based study. And to conclude, in fact, where we should be heading to, what we should consider is that, and I've mentioned it before, is that today these pragmatic practice-oriented trials are in the post-marketing phase, which means that the patient has to wait and the clinician has to wait a long time before the results of these trials become available to optimize treatment and to give the evidence-based intervention to the patient. Ideally, some aspects of such pragmatic practice-oriented trials should be introduced already in trials that start in the pre-market phase, for example, after phase 2. With the long enough follow-up, with the patient relevant endpoint, with patients that represent the routine care, with the comparator that is the usual care. It can be integrated with the phase 3 trial, or it can be a separate trial, but that would, at least for patients, allow faster access to evidence-based medicine. So I would like to stop here, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you. And I will now switch on my camera.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, thank you.
perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Holstart. So now we'll start the Q&A portion of today's session. We'll also have Everardo join us as well, and then I think Mark Busey is also on the call if he's able to add some questions. And just, a quick reminder, everyone who is in the audience, you can continue to submit your questions in your chat box. So or the little questions panel, not the chat box, and then you can submit those, and if we'll get to them today, it'll be great. If not, then we'll answer them after the webinar and send some responses then. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Thanks, Kelsey. So thank you very much, Frank. Mark is probably having his camera or video switched on. I'm not sure, but I know he's followed from the beginning. There he is.
Yes. Hi. Hello. Hi, everybody. Hello, Frank. Good
Hello.
to see you, and thank you for the very nice talk.
We have quite a few questions, Frank. But I just wanted to ask one from this viewer who required a clarification. So I thought it was important to make it as the first question. What do you mean by practice-oriented and pragmatic trials, respectively? In other words, do you make a distinction, or you consider them as the same thing?
It's not one and the same thing, but we try to combine both. Practice changing, of course, or practice oriented or practice changing is clearly with the aim to change practice and to compare, for example, directly to types of interventions. It can be both pharmaceuticals, it can be If I give an example of a trial that we funded is in irritable bowel syndrome, where we compare the spasmolytic drug versus a specific diet. But we conducted that trial in a very pragmatic way, meaning that the physician prescribed the study drug, so no specific labeling whatsoever. The patient still needed to go and collect that study medication at the local pharmacy. And on the other hand, you have the same prescription, but then for a diet, also with some guidance. So that is the very pragmatic approach, but both can go together to change practice. And
Right.
and then the last remark would be to move as much as possible to existing data collections now that we are entering the digital health area. At least we should be there already, but in practice we are not. And so electronic health records that can be used for randomized clinical trials are not always there. They are not coded. The quality may not be perfect. The same goes for registries. So that's an important move we still need to make in many countries. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question here. What are the main practical difficulties that could be faced when conducting a pragmatic trial compared, for example, with a classic clinical trial?
Well, when I look back to the studies that we've been funding over the past 5 years now, where it went wrong is that when we compare interventions that can be already initiated in primary care, and the study is actually conducted by medical specialists in a hospital, and we have already primary care physicians starting one of the two arms in that case. That is where, of course, it was more difficult for the specialists to recruit still eligible patients. So there, despite our feasibility checks at the start of the trial, we could not recruit well. But in most of the trials, with the different checks and balances, before we actually sign any funding contract, we have seen rather good recruitment. Of course, now with COVID, all the trials have been delayed and there have been specific issues, but that's another issue, of course.
Okay, thank you. So let me try to flesh out this question here. The viewer says, on the one hand, pragmatic trials require PROs and relevant endpoints, but these may require long follow-up, including in phase 3. So as you suggest, this could delay a regulatory conclusion. So instead of having a drug earlier for at least some patients, if we follow the traditional path, that's what I understand, we might have it even later, arguably for more patients. But and then there is a question at the end, but it's a trade-off, is it not?
It's indeed a trade-off, but the situation we have now where medicines enter more and more rapidly, but then past the regulatory system, but then still the clinicians don't know how to use the drug, like in oncology, how to optimize the treatment, how to combine. So, and if you still have to start the additional study in the post-marketing phase, you lose even more time before you're sure that the patient can benefit from the new intervention. So probably there should be a combination of both worlds, but with a rapid access to patients, but then also with the comparative effectiveness trial or the treatment optimization trial, whatever you call it, already starting in the market phase, so that you have your treatment optimization results more rapidly to treat patients in an evidence-based way as quickly as possible. So I think both can be combined, and there a close collaboration between the regulators and the healthcare payers and the HTA bodies, and also the clinicians. I'm thinking about EORTC, for example, in Europe, and they have a clear vision on what is needed. So that is essential, I think, and the time is right now that to make these changes, I think, in collaboration with the regulators, for the benefit of the patient, in fact.
Of course, right. Okay. I have a very specific questions here, and then I'll hand it to Mark because he might have some questions as well. This also comes from the audience. It's very specific. Do you see any difference in gene therapy based trials? So,
well, yes, there is, of course, interventions that have a single shot and have a lifelong consequence, but also there, for healthcare payers, this is a challenge, and no one is discussing this, that this is a challenge, and so to pay like a very high price and with a follow-up that is still insufficient to know and really assess the lifelong benefit of the patient. So there also one has been looking for specific payment schedules and to take into account the uncertainties. But it remains a balance there to be found, and I think all parties need to agree that you cannot ask a huge price if it is not certain that the patient will have a long-term benefit. So there also perhaps such adapted payment schedules might be more appropriate. Yeah, so it is indeed a very specific situation. I agree.
okay. Mark, if you don't want, I have another question here. If what you want to ask something, or
Please go ahead.
okay. So Frank, the question is, what is the gain by an actual trial as opposed to making paper calculation comparisons? I'm not sure the person is referring to, for example, a network meta-analysis. I don't know exactly what is meant by a paper calculation comparison, because it could be different things. But what do you make of this?
Yeah, all the matching between observational data, you can only match for those variables that, first of all, are available, and you can never balance for the unknown. And that was why that is the charm of randomization, that you even balance for the unknowns, which you can never do when you have to match observational data and make a comparison. And it has been shown that such matching may lead to a different conclusion compared with a randomized trial. So unless the treatment effect is huge, which unfortunately is not often the case, you need to be very cautious with the paper approach, as this viewer calls it.
Okay.
And the same goes for network meta-analysis, in fact. So you need also to be very, very careful that also there that this is an appropriate method. Yeah. But I don't need to convince you you're a statistician.
Well, I'm not. I'm a physician.
He plays the
I need
statistic.
convincing. Okay, so I have another one. This is about KCE. Did KCE collaborate with pharmaceutical companies to conduct any pragmatic trial? Or maybe the main approach of KCE is to conduct a publicly funded trials and 100% non-commercial. So what is the breakup? What is the...
Yeah, indeed, a good question. So the main aim, the primary aim of the trials that KCE is funding should be non-commercial. This has to do with also with state aid rules and so forth. Of course, we have situations where study drug and placebo, for example, are provided by a pharmaceutical company. And of course, then the terms and conditions of the funding become crucial. And one of the terms and conditions is that there is a non-exclusive license to the pseudonymized data base to the healthcare institutes like KCE, but also others in Europe, so that they can use the data set, in fact, also, for example, for health economic modeling. And we try to collect all the quality of life data, of course, also so that utilities can be calculated for. So yes, we have pharma companies being involved, but then the discussion is always about no strings attached, and so that we can use the data for healthcare decision making, and we cannot give an exclusivity to any pharma company on the data. But of course, they can use them for regulatory purposes as anyone else. Yeah. And this is important, for example, in the field of repurposing, where still today it is impossible to have the label changed without the support from a pharma company. And this has pros and cons, but that is also a situation that is to be discussed probably with regulators and with the European Commission and Europe, and then at least, yeah.
Okay, Mark, I have another one here. Can I?
Sure, go ahead.
Frank, measurement of PRO cannot typically rely on routinely collected administrative data, given the traditional poor interest in such measurements. So how would you recommend to proceed with the collection? ePRO with an ad hoc app designed for this purpose, or paper collection if you want to optimize PRO collection?
We have both. We have well, I will not advertise, but I know RedCap has this option to collect patient-reported outcomes. We have situations where an app was specifically designed and used for that purpose, and we have the paper collections, and both all options work. One is perhaps more expensive than the other to fund. I haven't checked that, but that might very well be the case with the paper one. Yeah.
Okay. Mark, it's your last chance. Go ahead.
Well, there is one more question from the audience, Eduardo, which one I might read to Frank.
All right.
For new drugs, it's the last one on the list here. Do you think it would be better to adopt the medical device route, where the time to market is rapid, but widespread adoption has to wait for results from pragmatic RCTs? This would mean that patients who have the greatest need would benefit more quickly.
Yeah, so this gradual introduction could work for both for devices as well as pharmaceuticals. In fact, where in the first stage, while this more practice-oriented pragmatic trial is still ongoing, that you have kind of a registry where you, in addition then to the randomized trial, you still have some control of what is happening, so that you measure, for example, also safety in this registry, so that that indeed could be an approach. I know for the medical devices now in Europe, at least, more clinical data will be expected before the CE mark can be used. And so there will be more European collaboration also with EMA on the medical devices, and definitely the interface with the pharmaceuticals, which is also becoming more and more important. So yeah, and perhaps yeah, that's indeed for medical devices an important evolution. I think they're moving yeah, towards one another, I think, and high-risk medical devices and pharmaceuticals and the interface of the two. Yeah.
Okay, I
Wonderful.
hear the
I'm
church
sorry, but the
bell
time is up,
calling.
unfortunately.
Yes.
I had more questions, but it will be for next time.
All right, back to you, Kelsey.
Thank you all so much. Thank you very much for facilitating the Q&A, and thank you, Dr. Frank Holstart, for presenting. That was an excellent presentation. So we've reached the end of our Q&A portion of the session. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll follow up after the webinar. And if you have any further questions, you can just direct those to info@iddi.com. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email from us with access to the recorded archive for this event, as well as I think some other webinars are housed there as well. And there's also a survey window that'll be popping up on your screen after the webinar. So we'd really appreciate it if you could give us your feedback there, and that will help us improve on any future webinars as well. So again, thank you very much for joining. Thank you to our speaker. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.